Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this old video, I have a story for you. The story of Mr. Cool, Mark Jensen. See, Marky Mark over here was quite the guy. In a place called Pleasant Prairie, there the Jensens lived, unhappily. There were doubts, there were lies, there were letters written by ghosts. And I say ghosts because murders are always haunting. Let's give it a go. Pleasant Prairie, a small village in the state of Wisconsin, is home to about 20,000 people. Does it live up to its name? Though I do need to mention, there was a massive explosion there over 100 years ago. 300 tons of dynamite and 100,000 kegs of blasting powder, blasted the ever-living shite out of the town. The explosion was felt 130 miles in every direction. Swiftly moving on. So I hear you're barking, big dog. Mike, why are you talking about this small town? Well, that's because some key players, my friends, they live there or something. The players were the Jensens, Mark and Julie. Mark and Julie, a married couple who had been together for the long haul, and haul ass they did. They met while studying in college. This was in the neighbouring town of Kenosha. Mark was selling suits, working his way through college, while Julie was taking the easy way out and becoming a nurse. Joke, an incredibly hard and thankless job. Thank you, nurses. Now, the thing about Mark and Julie is that they were quite different people. Julie, beautiful. A smile that could light up the room is a phrase you've never heard before. Mark, on the other hand, that's a smug grin that could blow out candles if you ask me. He carried an ill-favoured look. He kind of looks like Jim Carrey's The Mask, but without the green. You know. Julie, an incredibly kind, thoughtful, generous person. Someone who had her own issues since she was young, depression namely, but you wouldn't know to meet her. And who knows what she saw in Mark. I think even God would shrug at that one. But they ended up marrying each other. Julie actually dropped out of college once they married. She never did become that nurse. And Mark himself went on to work in finance like his father before him. He looks like he would. Either that or become a school principal. So Mark Jensen became a stockbroker, and Julie became a stay-at-home mom. First to Dave, then to Doug. And so life went on, you know, a quiet, unassuming family life in this quiet, unassuming town. Not for long. Julie was so happy. She was all about her boys, the 3 Ds in her life. That was literally her license plate, my 3 Ds. She was mad for the D. She did everything with them at school, they had the pool, she took them to lessons, she wanted people to be happy. She made things work in the family. Or at least, as we so often see, on the surface, that's how things look. But they ain't that way. See, in the early 90s, shortly after the birth of her first son, Julie filed for divorce. Why? I hear you asking. Well, Mark, turns out he sucked. A man who was like a cold, emotionless robot. It seemed he just didn't want to be there, didn't want to be in the family. He was the reason she didn't finish school. He was the reason she was a stay-at-home mom. He was the reason she had no one to talk to. She in fact ended up having an affair. And so when divorce came on the cards, Mark simply said, nope, not happening. If you want to leave, you better want to leave your son too, because I'm taking him. And so that was enough to keep her to stay. She stayed for the first son and then for the second. And then some weird shit started happening around the house and like around the garden. Pictures started getting posted, like under the door, on their windshields, their car windshields, like on the windows, under pots in the garden. Pictures of the porno kind, very graphic stuff. I know, right? What kind of graphic? Give me examples, visually. But Julie was freaked out because the women in these pictures, they looked just like her. Then she started getting anonymous phone calls, like lured, somebody on the phone talking to her, bringing up the affair, mentioning all these like creepy details, kind of like terrifying, sick shit. Mark and Julie, they went to the police to report the stalking. However, the first person they were thinking of, the guy she had had the affair with, he had bounced. He had left town like ages ago. It wasn't him. It couldn't possibly be him. Somebody else knew about the affair and was torturing them. Torturing Julie with it. And the pictures and the calls, they continued for years. Years. It got so bad, they eventually hired a private detective to try and find out who the shit was doing this to them. And the detective promptly turned around and said, "Oh, hey, Julie, this might seem a bit out there, a bit wacky, but, it's clearly your husband. It's clearly Mark doing this to you. He's torturing you because you had an affair and pretending it's some weird stalker." Julie said, "Get the fuck out of here. It couldn't possibly be the cold, emotionless husband of mine who wanted to torture me after I slept with another guy. Get it! You're talking shite." And as the years went by, Julie, developing a small but close circle of friends, would share how she was afraid of Mark. She was scared of him. She was always worried about making him mad. And when she would say this to them, they would respond with the logical, ditch his ass. She would say, I can't. Because if I do, he will kill me. It was in December 1998 that things came to a head. Julie went to her local doctors. She needed treatment for her depression. She was not doing well. And the following day, after the doctor's appointment, which was the 2nd of December, she was unable to get out of bed, but she couldn't rest. Mark then went back to the doctors, asking for help, and the doctor gave him sleeping pills, Ambien, all of that kind of stuff. Mark, actually at the time, was giving Julie a lot of stuff to keep her in bed. The next day, Julie was having difficulty breathing. Mark said, she's fine, she's grand. Don't need to call the hospital or anything. She'll be fine. She'll sleep it off. That was the same day Mark decided not to go to work, while his sons went to school. Then he picked up his sons from school and brought them home, but told them to wait in the living room while he checked on Julie. So he goes off, checks on her. Minutes later, he comes back into the living room where his 2 young sons are standing. He says, "Guess what, kiddo? Mom's dead." EMTs arrived, but nothing could be done. The police also arrived, and they documented everything. Now, the reason they were documenting it from the start was that it was a suspicious death. And until suspicious becomes the opposite of suspicious, not suspicious, they have to treat it like it's suspicious. Initially, Julie's death was ruled as natural causes, self-inflicted, but the police and the county prosecutor had their own suspicions. Suspicions Mark did not allay. And within a week, Mark had essentially removed all traces of Julie from the home. At Julie's funeral, he was having a great time. He was telling good ones, he was cackling away to himself. He did not seem at all upset that his wife had died of some mystery illness. In fact, he seemed all the happier for it. Happier, maybe, just maybe, because he had a new belle in his life. Kelly Labonte worked for the same company Mark did. She worked in St. Louis, and he frequently made trips down to her. And when the police took Mark's computer to examine it, as they had to examine all evidence, they found a lot of romantic emails between the two. Their affair had been an open secret in the office. Everybody knew. Except for Julie, maybe. So Mark was now free to be with Kelly Labonte, and had finally gotten rid of the wife he'd spent the last few years torturing. He hadn't even bothered to hide his affair from Julie. She knew about it, but she was just so scared of him, she put up with it. Now, what actually killed Julie remained a mystery. There was nothing obvious or evident that had caused her to lose her life. In fact, that she had done this to herself in her depression was a primary theory. But there were others too. Because Mark was not keeping his joy, his new love, his lack of giving a shit to himself. In fact, police would also discover more emails between Kelly and Mark. Emails that were, because Kelly was in a relationship too. So they were emailing each other about, oh, hey, I just want to be with you. We really wish I wasn't married. That'd be pretty sweet. That'd be pretty swell. Kelly, she was married to somebody else, but she wasn't able to decide if she wanted to be with Mark or be with her husband. So Mark and Kelly, they set themselves up this little deadline, if you want, for, shit or get off the pot. Are we gonna make this affair legit, or are we gonna, go back to our spouses? Will it be too legit to quit, you might say? The date they had set for the deadline of are we doing this or not was December 31st, and Julie died 3 weeks before then. The police had found the sexual emails between Mark and Kelly, and they had some real hard-on questions they'd like to ask Mark. Questions they wouldn't put to him until April 1999, and Julia died in December 1998. These suspicions had reached a boiling point, and so they sat Mark's ass down. And Mark was happy to be sat down. He wanted to straighten it all out.
But we need to find out what happened here.
Paul, I did not do anything to hurt her. There was a question between myself and the kids that morning whether or not to call an ambulance. Her breathing was funny. She could hardly get out of bed. I mean, it was a god-awful situation.
Here in your statement, Wednesday, December 3rd, Julie could hardly move. Here 9 p.m. told me that she was fine and she wanted to commit suicide. And on Wednesday morning, Julie asked me not to call anyone, meaning not to call her help. She wanted to die, right?
Yeah.
So on Wednesday morning,
she asked me not to call anybody.
she's pretty bad off.
Wednesday morning, she wasn't looking good. She couldn't. No motor control.
Did you call the rescue squad that Wednesday, you think? She was bad off enough to where she should have called the rescue squad, but she didn't want you to.
She didn't want me to. Well, right, I should have. In hindsight, I know that.
So you didn't do anything to aid in her death, but you didn't do anything to stop her from dying.
I really didn't. I mean, I just watched it happen.
Mark denied any romance with Kelly during these questions.
Who's Kelly?
My boss's secretary.
Was Kelly a girlfriend of yours, or?
No, just a friend.
And that's what, this is all work related here? I didn't see work related. So she's your girlfriend now, or at least somebody you're dating?
Friend,
or a fair statement of dating, or what do you
guess you would call it maybe a date. Dating.
He was lying, and they knew it, and he must have known they knew it. They also confronted him about the porno images that had been placed outside the home for years. They knew it was obvious to everybody that Mark had been doing it. Mark had been torturing his own wife. Julie probably knew Mark had been doing it. She just didn't want to admit it.
Mark, you had to do something.
I did not know.
How can I explain this?
I don't know.
I don't know.
And then, they had a big one. They gave Mark this letter.
Read it. Just stay here. Let me go grab a soda.
A letter written by Julie. Mark had never seen this letter before in his life. He had no idea it existed. It was a secret letter. The ghost of Julie speaking to anyone who would listen. The police did. The letter read, Pleasant Prairie Police Department. I took this picture, and I'm writing this on Saturday, November 21st, 1998 at 7 a.m. This list was in my husband's business daily planner. Not meant for me to see. I don't know what it means, but if anything happens to me, he would be my first suspect. Our relationship has deteriorated to the polite superficial. I know he's never forgiven me for the brief affair I had with that creep 7 years ago. Mark lives for work and the kids. He's an avid surfer of the internet. Anyway, I do not smoke or drink. My mother was an alcoholic, so I limit my drinking to 1 or 2 a week. Mark wants me to drink more, with him in the evenings. I don't. I would never take my life because of my kids. They are everything to me. I regularly take Tylenol and multivitamins. Occasionally take the over-the-counter stuff for colds, Zantac or Imodium. Have 1 prescription for migraine tablets, which Mark uses more than I. I pray I'm wrong, and nothing happens. But I am suspicious of Mark's suspicious behaviours, and fear for my early demise. However, I will not leave David and Douglas. My life's greatest love, accomplishment, and wish, my 3 Ds. Daddy, Mark, David, and Douglas. That definitely made for interesting reading when Mark saw it. See, that letter had been given to the Jensens' next door neighbours about a week and a half before Julie died. She said, if anything happens to me, give it to the cops. See, Julie had become very close with their next door neighbours, and about 3 weeks before she died, she'd come over crying, scared that Mark was trying to kill her. She really believed it at this point. See, as Julie said in the letter, she didn't drink much, right? But Mark was trying to ply her with red wine all the time that she believed was poisoned. She also found syringes in one of his drawers and believed he'd been trying to inject her with something. She had seen open pages on his computer. Several of the open pages had been about poisoning. He wasn't keeping this fucking subtle at all. Like, he may as well have just drawn a big skull and crossbones, like, on the wall or something said. You won't believe it. I'm trying to kill you. See, Mark severely underestimated Julie. Poor naive Julie, he thought. She'd never suspect a thing. His arrogance was overwhelming. He thought, I can have it all. I can get that cheeseburger and milkshake. I can have the promotion and that chick on the side. I will kill my wife. So Mark was confronted with that letter, and if you listen closely, you can hear his thoughts.
Leaves us this letter, okay? And then all of a sudden, boom, she turns up dead. I'm not making this up. This is true evidence. And here we have Julie Jensen telling me that if she dies, you're the person that did it. If anything happens to me, he would be my first suspect. I know he's never forgiven me for the brief affair I had with that creep 7 years ago. I have been doing this 15 years, Mark, and I've never had anybody leave me a letter telling me that if they die, it's this person that killed me.
So that, combined with his actions, combined with his internet searches of poisoning, he had tried to erase them, but they were recovered. Well, didn't look good. It would ultimately be determined that Julie had been poisoned with antifreeze. Antifreeze poisoning, it's something we've seen many a time. It's a very rough way to go. It crystallizes you from the inside out, and it's an extremely painful way to go out. It was interesting, they could in fact see when he'd begun poisoning her, and what stages of the poisoning she was going through. Because Mark was essentially Googling, I put antifreeze in her drink, or whatever, and she's not dead. He was trying to match her symptoms to the stages of antifreeze poisoning. It seemed like he was freaking out that she wasn't dying quickly enough. They never found it because Julie was only tested for ethylene glycol after they found out he'd been searching for it. They had never tested for it before, hence why they didn't know up until now what had killed her. Now Mark was still a free man, however, for years. So much so, he later married Kelly. Kelly had swiftly divorced that guy back in Missouri. She became guardian of his kids, and together they had another child. But it just took them that long to charge him. It was always thought there just wasn't enough. Until 2002, that is. Mark Jensen went on trial in 2008, if you can believe that, almost 10 years after he murdered Julie Jensen. At trial, the prosecution had kind of everything. It wasn't so much a smoking gun as it was like a smoking 50 cal.
As Julie Jensen lay in her bed, suffering, desperately ill, her husband, Mark Jensen, knew exactly why she was sick, why she was ill, why she was suffering. As he lay next to her that night in the marital bed on the evening of December 3rd, 1998, as she was barely able to breathe, Mark Jensen lay there next to her, knowing what she was going through because he'd read all about it on the internet in the months preceding her death.
Did Mark Jensen ever discuss with you harming his wife?
No, he never did. If he had, I would have run as far away from him as possible.
If Mr. Jensen was planning to murder his wife, he had a good motive to not tell you about that, right?
I suppose so.
Because you wouldn't want to marry a wife murderer, would you?
No.
The defense, however, said, guess what? No. You want to know what the real story here is, folks? She did it by her own hand. She's a trickster. In fact, she was a little depressed, and so before she did it to herself, she wanted to make everything look like it was Mark. She wanted all signs to point at Mark as a revenge.
People who are depressed feel hopeless. It's a dark place, it's terrifying, it's frightening because there's no way out. And we'll come back to the letter many times, and you'll have to decide whether it's a blueprint for framing her husband or legitimate. Finally, after 9 long years, Mark Jensen can clear his name. Finally, after 9 years, the story will be told about how Mark came to be falsely accused of this crime.
She gave the letters, looked up the poison stuff on the computer, all to make it look like Mark had killed her. It was her way of getting revenge against a husband who was icing her out. Interesting theory, let's see if it holds any water. Just checked and it doesn't. A key witness for the prosecution was a co-worker of Mark's named Ed Klug.
Do you remember who started complaining about whose wife first?
I think it really was Mark. Mark told me if you wanted to get rid of your wife, that you could go to websites that would tell you how to poison your wife, how it would not be detectable.
One day, about 2 months before the murder of Julie Jensen, they had been on a work trip together. Mark had gotten real, he'd had a few sups too many at the bar, and he kind of just started to talk about how he was going to kill his wife, the exact way he would do it, what exactly antifreeze poisoning does to the human body, kind of just going on and on and on to Ed, who was just sitting there being like, Okay. After 3 days, the jury came back with a guilty verdict. The letter written by Julie being the most damning piece of evidence against him, as it should be.
I have sentenced scores of people to prison for murder, and when I assess the entire mountain of facts and evidence that exist in this case, I come to the conclusion that if I were to impose anything less than the maximum sentence in this case, I'd feel I had cheated the other people, because your crime is so enormous, so monstrous, so unspeakably cruel. Mr. Jensen, it is the sentence of the court that your custody be committed to the Department of Corrections for confinement in the Wisconsin state prisons without possibility of parole for the remainder of your life. You may be seated.
He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For about 15 years, because his conviction was later thrown out, as was that letter. See, the courts ruled that the letter should not have been admissible, that the jury shouldn't have seen it. As the writer of the letter was now dead, it couldn't really be used as evidence, nothing definitive. So, in 2023, a guy who's got a face made for a fist was back in court.
This is Julie Jensen. She didn't kill herself. She didn't frame her husband to make it look like a homicide. She didn't abandon her kids and try to take away their father too. She lived for her kids and she died because the defendant murdered her.
The evidence is going to show that Mr. Jensen, while not being perfect, is not a murderer.
And it went the same way as the first time.
Guilty of intentional homicide.
Especially when prison witnesses would step in saying he wouldn't shut up in prison about killing his wife.
Yeah, he gave her the Ambien, he gave her more juice with antifreeze in it, and she was sleeping, and then she started throwing up a little bit.
Or about the fact that the poison wasn't working quick enough, so Mark forced Julie's face into the pillow, suffocating her. At the end of his retrial, he was, once again, congrats Mark, found guilty of the murder of Julie Jensen. However, at sentencing, Mark pleaded with the judge for the chance of getting parole one day. For his kids' sake, for his family's sake.
Judge, Mr. Jensen is going to make a statement to the court.
Go ahead, Mr. Jensen.
Judge, I ask you to grant parole eligibility and I ask you to consider the following. I have always sought to be a productive member of the community. My parents are 87 and 85, and they need my help. I want to be there to help them and to be able to spend time together while we are able. I have a special relationship with each of the three boys and love them dearly. They lost their mom and me during very important years of their lives. Please grant parole eligibility so that the family and I can move forward and heal. I can work to understand and find acceptance with the verdict. I can be there for my family who needs me. And please provide me the opportunity to show I can continue to do something positive with my life. Thank you.
It's a serious charge. It's first-degree intentional homicide. There's no higher felony in the state of Wisconsin. The prison sentence has to be life in prison. I can't change that. The only issue for the court is whether the defendant will be eligible for parole. The issue for parole is, well, I want to be there for my boys, I want to help them, and I want to help my family. Well, that's a good thing. But what about Julie? She has nothing today. She's dead. She's never going to see her children get married, have successful lives, be there for the holidays. He caused that. He's the one that put that in motion. He says, well, now my boys don't have two parents. Well, guess what? He's the one that murdered Julie. He's not getting any parole eligibility. It's too serious of a crime to depreciate. It was too vengeful.
Where's your shit-eating grin now, pal? And there you have it, the story of hatred built up slowly over years due to a brief affair she had, one he never forgave her for, and in fact decided to make her life a living hell. Julie wanted to leave Mark after she had the affair. She wanted to get away, and he wouldn't let her. He wanted to keep her so he could torture her for years and years. A slow torture, the slow torture of Julie Jensen. But in the end, Julie would have the last laugh, writing the letter essentially from beyond the grave that would, well, she would have the last laugh because now Mark Jensen is the one who will have the slow torture for the rest of his natural life. Thank you so much for watching. It really means the world to me. I hope you enjoyed this whole video. Please, if you're looking for more content, you can check out early access bonus videos on Patreon for $2 a month. Please check out the That Chapter podcast with a new episode being posted every Monday. And until next whole video, which should be up in a couple of days, that should kind of wrap this one up. Until then, please take care of each other and yourselves, because I love you. Mike out.